Okay, so after getting these force plates and doing a few tests on myself and some other athletes, I had an hypothesis. I think that one of the key qualities to improve athleticism is your eccentric braking power. So how well can you stop momentum? How well can you apply the braking forces to the ground in order to stop momentum and reverse it for an amplified concentric? And as I have seen through many assessments that I have done now in the past months, some athletes use a lot of eccentric force during the counter movement jump, like I do myself. I think I'm a really eccentric dominant jumper, which can be seen from the impulse ratio, where you just divide the impulse that you put eccentrically by the concentric impulse, and the lower that number is, the more eccentrically dominant you jump. But I have seen that some athletes don't use an eccentric like that at all. They don't apply force during the braking action. They literally just kind of drop down, and then all they really rely on is propulsion to get out of the hole. So going by that, I thought, okay, let's improve eccentric metrics for my athletes. And so I started thinking which would be the best method to do that. So I came up with altitude drops. So here are the results measured objectively through force plates, a before and after testing, after incorporating 4 altitude drops as the main plyometric activity of the workouts during the leg days. So of course, I've also been doing other training. I've been doing regular strength training, squats, deadlifts, all that stuff. And I've done other plyometrics, regular double leg plyometrics, single leg plyometrics, and all that stuff. Also regular yielding plyometrics. But most of the volume went into altitude dropping. So here's what happened to my eccentric braking qualities measured through the force plate on a counter movement jump after doing 2 months of yielding altitude drops and also stiff altitude drops. So as you can see, the results are fucking insane. My braking RFD went up by 12%. My peak braking force went up by 8%. My average braking force went up by 10%. That's also really significant. And here's the craziest thing. My peak braking power went up by 30%. Look at this. This is an insane difference if you compare the 2 months to 2 testings, 2 months spaced apart. 30% increase in peak braking power. That's wild. And also, my average braking power also went up. So I did not really train my propulsive qualities. And as you can see, because I did not specifically use exercises that challenge the propulsive abilities apart from regular plyometrics and strength training, well, you have some propulsion in regular plyometrics where you're like double leg pogos or whatever. You have propulsion, but it's not kind of really being overloaded. It's more of the stretch and the eccentric forces that you need to handle. And now I'll show you what happened to my propulsive qualities. So during that 2 month period, you can see my propulsive qualities went down, minus 1.7%, minus 3%, and just my peak propulsive power went up by 5%. And this didn't change. This also barely changed. So you can see I did not put any work into propulsion at all. But here's what happened to my counter movement jump over those 2 months. My counter movement jump improved across the board. Everything went up. Look at this. These are the KPIs of my counter movement jump. And I went from 54 centimeters to 61 within 2 months. That's crazy, okay? My braking RFD obviously went up. My peak propulsive power went up a little bit. My braking force went up a little bit. And the force that I display at the reversal point, so at amortization, also went up because I was working a little bit on that amortization point. So what's the conclusion here for me? I'm an eccentric dominant jumper. I have a higher eccentric peak braking force than I have a concentric one in my counter movement jump profile. And this is why eccentric training is really, really potent for me. So I thought, after doing this, is this the key to athleticism? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So here's what I mean by I'm an eccentric dominant jumper. So this was my 61 centimeter jump, and look at the force curve. So my eccentric peak is at 2,200. My concentric peak is like 1.98. So you can see a nice steep curve here and a higher eccentric peak, which means I'm an eccentric dominant jumper. By the way, that's just what I came up with, eccentric dominant jumper. That's what I call it when I see a force time curve. And whether this is true or whether this is universally accepted, I don't really care. This is what I have found right now, and this is how I'm going to learn from this. So let's look at the other athletes that I've also trained, and let's see how athletes respond differently to training, and everybody needs something different. And this is where the power of the coach and force plates actually comes in to identify what that person needs. So here is a elite volleyball player. His running approach vertical is in the kind of low to mid 40s. You can see this is his initial assessment, 63 centimeters jump. Okay, this is crazy. And he's a more of a concentric dominant jumper. He does not attack the ground like I do in my counter movement jump. And you can see the steepness of the braking curve is not as steep as mine is. And his eccentric peak is lower than his concentric peak. So when he does a counter movement jump, he uses more of a concentric strategy, concentric dominant, propulsion dominant jumper. But here's what's really interesting about this guy. As soon as he has an impact, so for example, like in a depth jump, which is basically a counter movement jump just with an impact, he turns into an eccentric dominant jumper where he utilizes all that eccentric energy. You can see that here. Here, his eccentric peak force is higher. So this is the impact when he hits the ground after the drop. And this is his eccentric peak. This is his concentric propulsion peak. His eccentric peak is higher than his concentric one when he has an impact, okay? So then he turns into an eccentric dominant jumper, so to call. So now let's get to the interesting part with this guy. So he had a almost 2-month block of training. So the first 3.5 weeks were hell weeks, which is just building capacity, building the aerobic engine and building muscular endurance and all that stuff. So we didn't really do any high impact stuff, just a little bit light extensive plyometrics. And then we got into one strength phase, which went for 3 weeks, where he had really intense altitude dropping as the main intervention. And here's what happened to his counter movement jump. So you guys can see I'm not capping, almost 2 months block. And his counter movement jump actually went down. His braking RFD in the counter movement jump actually went down. His propulsive peak power actually basically didn't change. But here also barely no changes. So I started asking myself, what happened that this guy actually is jumping lower now? So let's look at his eccentric qualities. So as you can see, his braking RFD in the counter movement jump, it actually went down. Like his whole counter movement jump metrics really decreased. Like he got way worse. This is terrible. This is actually terrible to see. Minus 30% in peak braking power. That's actually horrible. And we didn't really work on propulsion at all. So his propulsive qualities basically remained unchanged. So let's remember, he doesn't really use an eccentric contraction too much in his counter movement jump. But when we look at this depth jump, the results are really interesting. So his average braking RFD in a depth jump went up like crazy. Plus 20% is crazy. His peak braking force actually decreased here. His average braking force increased significantly. His peak braking power decreased significantly, which is not as good. But his average braking power increased significantly. Plus 9% is really good. So why I believe that the peak braking power and the peak braking force went down is because we were doing deep yielding altitude drops. So we were trying to minimize the peak forces that we experience when we hit the ground. So that's what he was doing for 3 weeks. And his superpower is those stiff landings, really just minimal knee bend, stop the momentum really quickly. And I was having him go down deep to build that foundation of being able to load up and to minimize the forces that you experience. And I think that is what led to the high increase in the average braking force that he can apply, just to build out a nice base that he can then use for his short time, quick propulsive abilities. And that's why the peaks went down, because we were trying to minimize the peaks with his deep yielding landings, which is absolutely not a superpower. That's his absolute weakness. He doesn't like that. But now here's what is interesting. When we look at his propulsive qualities, which we didn't really work on, let's see what happened. His propulsive depth jump metrics all went through the roof. Plus 10% average propulsive force, plus 10% average propulsive power, plus 12% peak propulsive force. This is huge.
plus 10% peak propulsive power. This is a huge difference. Man, what the fuck? Look at this, 6.6K. And his propulsive phase increased in time. So he completes the propulsive phase of his jump in a shorter duration. And now let's look at what happened to his numbers actually. So his jump height actually went up by a centimeter. His time to takeoff, the time it takes him to complete the jump, went down significantly, minus 10%. That's really good. We love to see that, especially in a game like volleyball. We want to see that athletes can jump the same height in a shorter duration. He even jumped a little bit higher. This is really good to see. His force at minimum display, so the force that he displays at the reversal point of the jump also went up. This is a good marker of increased jump height. And then look at this, his stiffness measure went through the roof, plus 20% in stiffness. So he needs less time and less range of motion to complete a higher jump. And what's more, we got all these improvements while he gained a little bit of weight. So we did some chest flies and a little bit of upper body work, and he actually gained some muscle, he told me. So this is crazy, okay?
So this is a really interesting case. He does not use an eccentric stretch like that in the counter movement jump, but he does when he does a depth jump. And doing these deep altitude landings where he really loads up and tries to dissipate those forces generally improves his ability to handle eccentric forces, to be then able to display a better concentric when he pushes out of the depth jump. This is absolutely fantastic. Now he has laid a great base for us to do stiff altitude landings on, which you can see here, so that he has a greater potential for outputs later on. And now his next training phase, we're going to work on his superpower. We're going to do stiff altitude landings, and we're going to work the heck out of propulsion and ankle stiffness and all those things that are associated with pushing out of the bottom.
All right, so let's look at athlete 3. Also not a really eccentric jumper, kind of more of a force jumper, concentric jumper. And let's look at what happened to him. So as you can see, 52 centimeters on his first counter movement jump. Lower eccentric peak than concentric peak, and that was consistent for all of his counter movement jumps. Now, 1.5 months later, we done 5 weeks of hell weeks, so just building out the base, strength endurance, no intense plyometrics, no intense impacts. And then we did a 4-week phase of altitude dropping and strength training and other high impact plyometrics. But the main thing was, again, altitude dropping with a yielding deep landing. Let's see what happened to him. So 1.5 months later, almost 2 months later, it's the same height, okay? His counter movement jump did not change in height, but his eccentric peak is a little bit higher than it was before. So it's still more concentric dominant, but I would even call this balanced out. However, his eccentric force output improved on all of his counter movement jumps. Look at this. This is closer than it was before. You see this? It's almost as high as the concentric one. And if we look at his previous trials, not even close. Look at this. Not even close, all right? So we can tell that actually did something to him. So his jump height did not change, but let's look at his eccentric metrics during the counter movement jump. Those went absolutely bazooka. Eccentric qualities over that block, you can see here, 1.5 months, a little bit more than that. Plus 10% significant change in braking RFD. Peak braking force went up by 16%. Average braking force up by 13%. Peak braking power up by 30%. This is crazy. This is a phenomenal improvement. And average braking power plus 46%. Look at this. He got so much more efficient during his braking action. Like the whole downward phase, he's so much better at handling the whole downward momentum. It went up by 46%. A higher average means you're doing really well during the whole phase. So why did the jump height not improve despite those crazy improvements in the eccentric part of the movement? Well, I think it's because he's a more propulsive dominant jumper, and all we did just improve his eccentric qualities, and he doesn't really use that during his counter movement jump. But I think we laid out a great base for him to work on. So let's see what happened to his propulsive qualities. So all of his propulsive qualities in the counter movement jump really went down. -4, -7, -6, -7. And all that happened was his propulsive phase went up. So he uses more of a, he even increased the time that he spends in the propulsive phase. But really the numbers all went down, okay? So this probably explains, because we didn't work on it, this probably explains why he's not jumping higher despite improved eccentric qualities. And also, if we look at his drop jump, okay, his drop jump also increased like crazy. Plus 20% average braking force, plus 5% peak braking force on a drop jump, plus 25 average braking power on the drop. He just got way more efficient at braking. But his peak braking power went down because we were yielding really deeply into the joints and not doing it stiffly, where that peak braking power is being challenged. And his average braking RFD went up like crazy as well. So what do all these things tell me? First, athletes react differently to training. They take different emphasis points from every exercise. But generally speaking, we can say that altitude dropping does improve eccentric qualities like crazy. The next thing it tells me is not everybody uses the same strategy for the counter movement jump. Increasing the eccentric braking power and all those eccentric qualities might not lead to an improvement in your counter movement jump if you don't rely on those eccentric qualities in your counter movement jump. But if you do in your depth jump, for example, you will have an improvement in your depth jump. The next thing it tells me is if you only do deep yielding altitude drops, that means you load up really deep into your joints, you will not improve your peak braking power as much as you will do the average power or the average force output over the braking action. And if you want to improve the peak, then it's going to have to be stiff. But I haven't fully confirmed the last one yet with the stiff stuff. So now all these athletes are, these two athletes that I mentioned in the end now, both of them are doing a stiff altitude dropping phase now, and then we will see what happened to their peak braking metrics. And we're also working on propulsion with them now, so we will see what will happen to their counter movement jump, their propulsive actions, because that's their their superpower. And I am expecting a big increase in depth jumping height and counter movement jumping height, and also drop jumping height and all those KPIs that we're looking for with those jumping tests, because we're working on their superpowers right now. And for myself, I will keep on doing, I'm on a different timeline than they are. I don't have a season starting in mid-August. So for me, it's different. I will be doing deep altitude drops again, and we'll see what happens to me after that. I will keep you guys posted. If you like this type of content, if you want to see more of my force plate findings and my experimenting, really, I'm just here learning simultaneously as I do these videos. If you like this, please leave a comment, like the video, let me know what you would like to see, what type of experiment you would like to see. And if you're interested in learning my training system, how I organize training, how I train my athletes, what are my business principles, how I gain my information as a trainer, then check the link in the description to my course. You will love it if you are a trainer or you want to become one. And for jump programs, also sidesoundtraining.com if you want to actually go through my training system. So subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get it.